Hello everyone, my name is Huy Phan from Queen Mary University of London. Today I would like to present the work Multi-view audio and music classification. Firstly, I would like to give a brief introduction and the motivation of our work. So when we do audio and music classification with deep learning, we have some common type of inputs. So if we are going to use spectrogram, we may choose Medscape spectrogram, gamma tone spectrogram, or constant Q's transform spectrogram. Or alternatively, we can use the raw waveform as input as well. And the observation is that one type of input usually leads to the good performance of some classes, and when we use another type of input, is usually good for some other classes. So this observation means that different kind of inputs seem to be complementary to each other. And therefore, if we're able to learn the joint embedding from multiple type input, we should able to leverage their strength and improve the performance. And in practice, we have two common schemes to learn with multiple inputs. The first one is we usually do concatenation the embedding, meaning we may have a network with multiple branches and then we concatenate the embedding of different branches of the network together. And if doing that, we are actually doing mid-level fusion. Another type of learning with multiple inputs is we do late fusion, meaning we have several network trained separately, and then we just need to fuse the decision together. However, learning jointly from multiple inputs is difficult and most of the time suboptimal, and it's aligned with the observation that learning from the multiple input not necessarily always lead to the better performance. And the weakness of concatenation scheme is that different subnetwork, like the one that I show in the figure here. So different subnetwork in the big network here may learn at different rate, and therefore they may converge and overfit at different times. And therefore, if we join the embedding of different subnetworks together, that becomes suboptimal. And if we do the late fusion, because we have separate training, and therefore we are unable to take into account the interaction across different views. In this work, we propose an alternative approach to learn from multi-view input efficiently via adaptive gradient blending. The idea is very simple. So building on top of the concatenation network we see in the previous slide. In addition to the concatenation branch, we also maintain a classification branch for each of the subnet. So we have one classification branch for the male spectrogram input, one for gamma tone spectrogram input, one for CQT input, and one for raw waveform input. And by maintaining each classification branch for each of the subnet, we're able to quantify and oversee the generalization and overfitting behavior of the subnet. And we'll go into more detail later. And as long as we're able to do that, we're able to harmonize the learning rate across different views so that the network or the subnetwork which is generalizing well will be encouraged to learn, whereas the one which is overfitting will be discouraged from learning. In the next few slides, I will describe more detail about how we can do adaptive gradient blending for multi-view learning. With a classification branch associated to each of the subnet, we are able to calculate the loss value for each of the subnet at any time during the training course. And we indicate or we denote the loss value for each of the subnet by LK in this equation. K, the index K here indicate the subnet and it take value between male spectrogram branch or gamma tone branch or CQT draw waveform and also the concatenation branch. And the N here is indicate the training time. And after that, the adaptive gradient blending is achieved via loss weighting. So what we need to do is we need to determine an appropriate weight for each of the subnet, and we compute the total loss of the network via the weighted sum here. And now the adaptive gradient blending is boils down to how to determine an appropriate weight for each of the subnet, so that a generalizing subnet will have a large weight to encourage the learning, whereas an overfitting subnet will have a small weight so that we discourage the learning of that subnet. Here we compute the weight W via generalization and overfitting measure, which are used to quantify the generalization and overfitting behavior of the subnet. So firstly, we define the generalization measure G as the information that we gain about the target distribution via training. And the overfitting measure O represents the gap between the information gained on the training set and the one we gain on the target distribution. So they can be computed using the two equations here, but if you can focus on the graph here, the explanation may be more intuitive. So in this plot, we have the blue curve represent the training loss and the red curve represent the true loss. In practice, we don't know the true loss at all, but we can always approximate it using validation loss. And assume that we have chosen a time as a reference time point, and we know the training loss and the true loss at the reference time. Then at the current time n, we can always compute the gap between the current true loss and the reference. And this here, the value G here represent the generalization measure. And for the overfitting measure, we can always compute the difference of the gap between the training loss and the true loss at the current time, and the gap between the training loss and the true loss at the reference time. And eventually the weight W can be computed as the ratio of the generalization and overfitting measure given in this equation, where we use the Z factor as a normalization factor. We further observe that the approximation that we use for computing the generalization and overfitting measure may depend on the reference that we choose. And in literature, the time zero usually chosen as the reference time, which is the time right after the network has been initialized with random weight. However, we find out that using the time zero as reference is may bias toward a specific random initialization. It means that with different initialization, we may have different loss references, and in turn, it leads to different results. Alternatively, we propose to perform gritty adaptation, where we use the best losses up to the current time as references. And furthermore, we update them during the training course as well. And to avoid the references get stuck at some local minima, we further smooth the losses with a average moving window. So in the multi-view learning network that we propose, we can use the concatenation branch outputs at the final. However, we can leverage multiple outputs of the network to form a self-ensemble decision as well. So let's denote Pk as the probability output on the subnet K. Then we can compute the weighted sum of the probability output across all the subnet. And the weight W diamond K here represent the optimal weight that we found in the final model. And eventually we can compute the probability output of the N and of the self-ensemble. And the final output, the final label eventually can be obtained by maximizing the probability of the ensemble probability output. So we conducted an experiment on 3 different data sets. The ECS50 is for environmental self-classification with 50 categories. The DK2016-1 for audio scene classification with 16 classes. And the GT-ZAN for music genre classification with 10 categories. And for the input for the male spectrogram, we opt to have 64 male filter bank. And similarly for the gammaton spectrogram, we also have 64 gammaton filter bank. And for the CQT, we also opt to have 64 frequency bins with 12 bins per octave. And we also use the raw waveform as inputs as well. And for each of the subnet, we use the convolutional recurrent neural network as a realization. So in this table, I show the classification accuracy obtained by different developed systems on the experimental databases. So we have here the self-ensemble obtained by our repose network, and the multi-view output here indicate the fact that we used the output of the concatenation branch at the final. And we compare with different baseline system here, the light fusion, the symbol concatenation fusion, and also the 4 different network trained on 4 different input separately. So the result here show that the repose network with adaptive gradient blending learning from multi-view outperform on the baseline, including the light fusion and the symbol concatenation. And furthermore, when we leverage multiple output of the network to form the ensemble, we can obtain further improvement on the performance. I show here on the left side the loss curves obtained by different classification branches of the multi-view network. So the upper 4 curves corresponding to 4 different subnetworks, and the one in red corresponding to the concatenation branch. And in the middle, I show the development of the loss weight during the training course, although it's very hard to interpret because the weight appeared to be noisy due to the gritty adaptation. But the interesting result that I want to stress is on the right. So we have the loss curves obtained by different separate network trained on the individual input separately. And also we have the loss curve corresponding to the symbol concatenation indicated by the blue curve here. And if we compare this curve with the one that we obtained from the concatenation branch in the proposed multi-view network, which is indicated by the red curve here, we see that the one of the proposed network is lower than the symbol concatenation branch, and of course it's lower than the 4 individual network trained separately. And this explains the better performance of the proposed network compared to the baseline. To sum up, we propose an efficient multi-view learning approach for audio and music classification. So the idea based on the fact that the network is able to oversee the generalization and overfitting behaviors of the subnet, and therefore is able to harmonize the learning rate of the subnet via adaptive gradient blending. We saw that the proposed methods outperform on the single view baseline, also the multi-view baseline based on the symbol concatenation and light fusion. Thank you for your attention.